In a quiet corner of history, before the red and gold armor and the grand battles, there was a child named Tony Stark. Born in 1970 to famed inventor and industrialist Howard Stark, young Tony's early years were marked by privilege and loneliness. Howard was brilliant but often absent, a man Tony later remembered as cold and calculating. In the void of his father's attention, Tony found companionship in creation. His genius bloomed shockingly early. At age 4, he built his first circuit board, and at 6, his first engine. By 17, he graduated summa cum laude from MIT, a prodigy with a mind that hungered for challenge. Yet genius came hand in hand with restlessness and ego. As a young adult, Tony inherited Stark Industries after his parents' sudden death in a car accident, becoming the youngest CEO of a Fortune 500 company at 21. He celebrated the promotion in his own style: fast cars, flashy parties, and a devil-may-care attitude. The world knew him as a genius, billionaire, Playboy, philanthropist, a moniker he would one day wear with pride. But beneath the swagger, Tony was a young man haunted by loss and a craving for approval, masking pain with wit and indulgence. At the dawn of the new millennium, Tony's hubris was on full display. In late 1999, at a science conference in Bern, Switzerland, he mingled with VIPs in a haze of alcohol and bravado. There, he briefly encountered an awkward scientist named Aldrich Killian, who begged for a moment of his time. Tony, ever impulsive, brushed Killian off, even promising to meet him on the roof later, only to leave the man waiting all night as Tony disappeared with another scientist, Maya Hansen. Tony forgot the encounter entirely. Killian did not. This seemingly trivial act of callousness would sow the seeds of a bitter vendetta. It was a glimpse of the collateral damage Tony's carefree arrogance could inflict on those around him, a lesson he had yet to learn. By his mid-30s, Tony Stark was living the high life as CEO and chief weapons designer of Stark Industries, the Da Vinci of our time, magazines proclaimed. He had revolutionized weapons technology, creating smarter missiles, high-tech armor, and even an advanced AI system, JARVIS, to assist him at home. With an iron suit of sarcasm and charm, Tony believed himself untouchable, his weapons ensuring freedom around the globe. This confidence carried him to a fateful demonstration in Afghanistan, where everything would change. In 2008, Tony traveled to the war-torn Kunar province of Afghanistan to showcase Stark Industries' latest marvel, the Jericho missile, a cutting-edge cluster munition. On a desert mountainside, he stood before a gathering of US military brass and let fly a single Jericho. The warhead separated and erupted across the distant ridges. Boom! A staggeringly effective display of force. A gale-force shockwave rolled over the observers as Tony casually spread his arms, basking in the awe. Ever the showman, he delivered his sales pitch with a smug grin. "They say the best weapon is one you never have to fire. I respectfully disagree. I prefer the weapon you only have to fire once." The officers laughed and applauded. The deal was sealed. Tony was on top of the world as he climbed into a convoy Humvee, sipping a drink and quipping without a care. In that moment, he was the quintessential genius playboy, pleased with himself and utterly unaware of the dark turn fate was about to take. Moments later, the idyllic scene shattered. The convoy was ambushed on a narrow mountain road, ripped apart. In a sudden storm of gunfire and rockets, Stark Industries' weapons, his own creations, whizzed and exploded all around him in enemy hands. Tony's security detail fought back fiercely, but one by one they fell. A Stark-branded mortar landed near Tony's vehicle and detonated. The blast slammed him to the ground, and jagged pieces of shrapnel pierced his chest. In a heartbeat, the confident titan of industry was reduced to a bleeding, semi-conscious man staring in horror at his name Stark on the bomb that had nearly killed him. It was an ironic signature on his mortality. The world faded to black as Tony Stark, gravely wounded, was captured by a shadowy terrorist group. He awoke in dimness and pain, alive against all odds. Tony found himself in a crude cave workshop turned prison cell. His chest throbbed. To his confusion and shock, he discovered an electromagnet implanted in his upper torso, attached to a car battery by wires. A soft-spoken captive, Dr. Ho Yinsen, informed Tony that he had operated on him. The magnet was keeping shrapnel shards from reaching Tony's heart. Yinsen, a doctor and fellow prisoner, had saved Tony's life with improvised surgery. Outside their cell, a network of caves crawled with armed men calling themselves the 10 Rings. These terrorists knew exactly who Tony was, and they had a demand: build the Jericho missile for us. Tony realized with dread that they possessed many Stark weapons already. He was quite literally a prisoner of his own legacy. At first, Tony was defiant. He saw the kind of destruction his weapons caused up close, and it sickened him. But refusal meant death, either at his captor's hands or when the shrapnel finally wormed into his heart if the battery failed. So he feigned cooperation, buying time. In captivity, Tony confronted the stark consequences of his former carelessness. This was the first time he truly faced danger without the buffer of privilege. "A man who has everything and nothing," Yinsen mused about Tony in conversation, noting that Tony had no family waiting for him. The words hit hard. In the forced stillness of that cave, Tony had no choice but to reflect on the life he'd led and the deaths his inventions had caused. It was a crucible for his conscience. Under the guise of assembling a missile, Tony and Yinsen instead hatched a daring escape plan. Tony's genius turned to an idea of necessity: build a suit of armor to fight their way out, with makeshift tools and scrap iron from stockpiled Stark weaponry. Tony designed an armored exoskeleton powered by a miniature arc reactor, a tiny, high-output electric reactor he could build to replace the car battery and sustain his heart. The two captives worked tirelessly for weeks, soldering circuits and hammering metal in secret, all under the noses of their gun-toting captors. Yinsen kept their captors at bay with clever stalling and lies, while Tony constructed the device that would later become legend. In the process, Tony got to know Yinsen, who spoke of his hometown of Gulmira and the family he hoped to reunite with. Their bond formed in those dire hours, Tony's sharp sarcasm softened by Yinsen's steady warmth. With each passing day, Tony's resolve hardened. He would not die here, and he would not build a weapon for these murderers. He would be the weapon, if needed, to get out. Finally, their invention was ready, a crude, grey iron suit outfitted with hydraulic strength, flamethrowers, and primitive missiles. Tony installed the new arc reactor in his chest, its pallid bluish glow now keeping him alive. The night their captors came to execute Tony for stalling was the night he and Yinsen decided to make their escape. As the 10 Rings thugs prepared to breach the workshop, Yinsen selflessly created a diversion. Grabbing a rifle, the doctor ran into the tunnels, drawing the guards away from Tony's hidden arming sequence. Tony begged Yinsen not to go out. It was suicide. But Yinsen smiled sadly. This had always been part of the plan. Gunshots echoed. Tony, heart-pounding, initiated the suit's powering up, each agonizing second marked by sparks and whirring gyros. By the time he lumbered forth, in the completed Iron Man Mark I armor, the firing had stopped. Tony found Yinsen mortally wounded, riddled with bullets. He dropped to his knees, cradling the man who had become his friend and savior. With labored breaths, Yinsen told Tony his family was already dead and that this was all meant to be. This was always the plan, he whispered. Tony's eyes welled with tears as he realized Yinsen had knowingly sacrificed himself. "Thank you for saving me," Tony choked out. Yinsen met his gaze, resolute and kind to the end. "Don't waste it! Don't waste your life!" Those final words lit a fire in Tony's soul. Yinsen passed, leaving Tony alone, but alive, with a mission. Tony gently closed Yinsen's eyes, grief etched on his face. The playboy who had never thought beyond himself now bore the weight of another man's hope and sacrifice. With righteous anger, Tony unleashed the full force of his makeshift armor. He roared through the caves, shrugging off bullets with the clang of metal on metal. The 10-ring soldiers panicked. What they thought was a meek prisoner had become an unstoppable iron giant. Fire billowed from Tony's built-in flamethrowers, engulfing the weapons stockpiles the terrorists had accumulated. He incinerated Stark missiles and munitions, ensuring they could never be used to hurt anyone again. Explosions rocked the cavern. As Tony marched through, an avenging figure silhouetted in flames. The very weapons he had made turned against those who misused them. Finally, punching his way into the open, Tony fought off the last of the guards and triggered a crude rocket boost. The Mark I suit, never intended for sustained flight, propelled him in a deafening blast out of captivity. Tony soared clear of the camp in a triumphant escape. But the victory was short-lived. His arc reactor sputtered and the suit began to break apart mid-air. Unable to control his trajectory, Tony crash-landed hard in the desert sands. The armor crumpled around him like a tin can. Dazed and injured, Tony crawled from the wreckage, down to nothing but the clothes on his back and the glowing device in his chest. But he was free. He had survived. Not long after, a US military helicopter on routine patrol spotted a lone figure stumbling through the desert. Remarkably, it was Colonel James "Rhodey" Rhodes, Tony's best friend, and the Air Force liaison to Stark Industries. Rhodey had never given up searching for Tony in the months he was missing. He lifted Tony into the chopper, stunned at the sight of his friend alive and whispering half-joking requests for an American cheeseburger and a press conference. Tony Stark was coming home a changed man. Back in the United States, Tony wasted no time in revealing his new direction. Still gaunt and dusted with sand, he called a press conference the very day of his return. Gathered in front of reporters and flashing cameras, wearing a humble t-shirt and looking nothing like the slick CEO they remembered, Tony made a bombshell announcement. Stark Industries would no longer manufacture weapons. There were audible gasps. His closest confidants were stunned. None more than Obadiah Stane, his father's old partner, and a father figure to Tony, who protested right on the spot. Obadiah tried to smooth it over as Tony being traumatized or not thinking clearly, but Tony's voice was steady. He meant every word. He had seen firsthand the horrors his weapons caused and declared he had to do something about it. Though the board of Stark Industries quickly moved to block his decision, the message was clear. Tony Stark's heart had turned. With the weapons division halted, Tony's life entered a period of intense transformation. Holed up in his Malibu mansion's workshop overlooking the Pacific, he poured himself into perfecting the Iron Man technology. Pepper Potts, his devoted personal assistant, and one of the few people he absolutely trusted, became increasingly concerned as Tony disappeared. for days tinkering. Tony, however, was driven by a dual purpose. To ensure his survival, his mini arc reactor was still keeping him alive, and to right the wrongs done with his weapons. He tasked Pepper with an unusual request to help swap out the arc reactor in his chest for an improved one. With shaky hands and witty banter to lighten the tension, Pepper extracted the original electromagnet device from Tony's chest and inserted an upgraded core. The procedure was a success, and in that vulnerable moment, Tony quipped it was Pepper's chance to kill or save him. She did save him professionally and personally. Afterward, Pepper encased the old reactor in a small glass display as a memento, labeling it proof that Tony Stark has a heart. The gift left Tony speechless, deeply moved, a reminder that someone cared about the man inside the machine. Tony's next goal was to build a refined Iron Man suit, one that could truly fly and defend. Deep in his garage, assisted by his AI JARVIS and his clumsy but well-meaning robot arms, Tony prototyped a sleek silver suit, the Mark II. He tested repulsor flight stabilizers, nearly blowing out the windows in the process, and then, in a moment of pure exhilaration, took the Mark II on its maiden flight. Whoosh! Tony rocketed above Malibu's nighttime surf, laughing in astonishment. For the first time, the man who had been trapped on the ground by terrorists felt the freedom of the skies. He pushed higher, blasting through the clouds, only to suddenly ice over and stall at high altitude. Alarms blared. Tony plummeted, desperately rebooting power and breaking a sweat until finally the ice melted and the engines refired. He managed to regain control just before smashing into the earth. It was a close call, but Tony was thrilled. He had flown, and he had learned. Engineering, after all, is about iteration. In short order, Tony developed the Mark III, solving the icing problem by plating the suit with a gold-titanium alloy. For style, and perhaps a touch of ego, he painted it hot rod red with gold accents, creating the iconic look of Iron Man. The upgraded armor was a marvel, stronger, weaponized with repulsor beams in the palms and a concussor unibeam in the chest and integrated with JARVIS's guidance. Tony's double life as a mechanic hermit raised eyebrows in his company. He skipped board meetings and ignored press inquiries. Only Pepper and Rhodey were privy to his secret project, and even Rhodey struggled to understand Tony's obsession until he saw the suit in action. That action wasn't long in coming. News arrived of a crisis across the world. Terrorists attacking the small Afghan village of Gulmira. Tony froze when he heard the name. Gulmira was Yinsen's home. Those same 10 Rings militants he'd escaped had now converged on the village using Stark weapons to massacre and enslave innocents. This was the grim aftermath of Tony's former business, and it hit him personally. Ignoring Obadiah's protests, and without government approval, Tony decided to intervene directly. Donning the Mark III's, Tony launched himself into the night sky on a mission of redemption. He streaked through the clouds and arrived in Gulmira like a steel comet. In a precise and furious display, Iron Man tore through the terrorist ranks. Villagers cowered or ran as this metallic savior rained justice on their oppressors. Tony targeted the militants' stockpiled Stark missiles first, blasting them to bits with surgical repulsor shots. He then took out armed trucks and tanks, disabling the heavy weapons that had been turned on families. In one dramatic sequence, Tony swooped down and plucked a father and son from the path of gunfire, his red and gold armor gleaming in the desert sun as he delivered them to safety. The terrorists' bullets pinged harmlessly off Tony's suit. Their RPGs could not lock onto the fast-moving target he'd become. Within minutes, the once fearsome 10 Rings cell was annihilated or in retreat. For the villagers of Gulmira, salvation had literally fallen from the sky. For Tony, it was a moment of profound validation. He used his technology not to destroy for profit, but to protect the innocent. The US Air Force, however, had no idea who or what was obliterating combatants in Afghanistan. 2 F-22 Raptor jets were dispatched to engage what the radar identified as a mysterious flying weapon. Soon, Tony found himself in an unexpected dogfight with American pilots. He tried to outrun them, darting among clouds, but the jets were persistent. One managed to clip him, sending him spiraling. "Ghost Rider, do you see a chute?" Rhodey, coordinating at base, heard that one jet was going down, its pilot ejected, but his parachute failed to open. Acting in a flash, Tony rocketed under the tumbling pilot and deployed his own flaps to slow the fall, saving the airman's life. In the confusion, Tony then called Rhodey on a private channel, revealing that the unidentified bogey was actually him in a suit. Rhodey was both stunned and exasperated. Following Tony's plea, Rhodey helped cover up the incident, reporting to his superiors that it was a training exercise that went awry. The world at large remained unaware. That Iron Man, a true superhero, had just made his debut. Back home, Tony's decision to stop making weapons and his secret heroics created enemies. Obadiah Stane, who had been a mentor to Tony since Howard's death, was livid about the arms business being shut down. It was revealed that Obadiah had his own dark agenda. He had been selling Stark weapons under the table to conflicts worldwide, and had even orchestrated Tony's kidnapping, hoping to remove his erratic prodigy and seize control of the company. When Tony returned alive, Obadiah feigned relief, but was plotting to salvage his schemes. He recovered the remnants of Tony's Mark I armor from the desert through the 10 rings, and with reverse-engineered Stark tech, began building a monstrous suit of his own. Tony first sensed something amiss when Pepper, at his request, hacked into company files and uncovered evidence of Obadiah's illicit arms deals and his involvement with the 10 rings. Before Tony could act, Obadiah made his move. In Tony's home, Stane revealed his betrayal. Using a prototype paralysis device, Obadiah stunned Tony. Tinnitus for 15 minutes, leaving him immobile and barely conscious. With cold malice, Stane ripped the very arc reactor from Tony's chest, the lifeline Yinsen had helped create. Tony was left to die slowly as the shrapnel in his blood edged toward his heart. Obadiah marched off with a triumphant sneer, using Tony's arc reactor to power his new creation, a gigantic iron suit codenamed the Ironmonger. In the wreckage of his living room, Tony clutched at his chest in desperation. His original arc reactor, the one Pepper had encased as a gift, was his only hope. With great effort, Tony dragged himself to that desk display. His vision blurred and breath shallow, he smashed the glass and grabbed the old device, shoving it back into the cavity in his chest. It sputtered to life. The familiar gentle glow reappeared under his shirt. It was not designed to run the advanced Mark III suit at full capacity, but it could keep Tony alive and at least partially power his armor. Summoning all remaining strength, Tony suited up. Iron Man took off into the night to confront Ironmonger in a final showdown atop Stark Industries headquarters. The battle that ensued was a clash of titans in the skies above Los Angeles. Obadiah, in a massive grey bulk of a suit armed with heavy weapons, proved to be a vicious foe. They traded blows on the rooftop, metal screeching against metal. Tony's smaller suit was more agile. He zipped around, firing repulsors that scorched the Ironmonger's thick plating. But the older arc reactor in Tony's chest struggled. To keep up with the output, warnings blared, as his power dropped. Obadiah's suit, powered by Tony's stolen reactor, punched like a freight train. He grabbed Iron Man and hurled him around like a rag doll. Crash! Tony was slammed onto the roof, dazed. In a desperate gamble, Tony flew straight up, luring Ironmonger high into the chilly night sky. As expected, Obadiah's suit began to ice over, a flaw Tony knew all too well. The hulking armor stalled and plummeted back toward the factory roof, but Tony's suit also lost power, and he barely managed a controlled fall. Both crashed back down, damaged. On the ground, Pepper, with SHIELD agents, had arrived and realized Tony was fighting Obadiah. With Tony distracting Ironmonger, Pepper took Tony's earlier frantic instruction and raced to the lab console, controlling the building's giant arc reactor, the industrial power source that ran Stark Industries. As Tony grappled with Obadiah, he shouted for Pepper to overload the reactor. Pepper hesitated. Tony was right there. The explosion could kill him, but Tony yelled that there was no other way. Trusting him, Pepper jammed the controls to surge. At the last second, Tony mustered one final burst from his suit's remaining power, leaping away as a column of brilliant energy erupted upward. The arc reactor went critical. A massive blast of white light engulfed the rooftop. Obadiah's Ironmonger suit took the full force. Electricity arced through it before the suit exploded, flinging Stain into the reactor core below. The reactor imploded with a thunderous boom, finally silencing the menace of Obadiah Stane. When the dust settled, Tony lay injured but alive on the ruined roof, his suit sparking and nearly drained. Pepper ran to him, relief and worry on her face. Obadiah was gone, Stark Industries was in shambles, but Tony Stark had survived yet another crucible, thanks in no small part to Pepper's quick thinking and courage. In the days that followed, SHIELD agents coached Tony on a cover story for the public. Iron Man was his bodyguard, and Stark Industries had suffered an unfortunate business malfunction. They wanted to keep the existence of the armored hero under wraps for now. At a press conference with reporters clamoring for the truth about the mysterious battle on the rooftop, Tony was handed cue cards with the official lie. He began to recite them. But Tony's defining trait has always been his inability to follow scripts. With the world watching, Tony paused, then impulsively announced, "The truth is, I am Iron Man." In that unscripted moment, Tony Stark discarded the concept of secret identities and claimed his new mantle openly. The press room erupted into chaos as cameras flashed and journalists shouted questions. Pepper's eyes widened. Rhodey chuckled in disbelief. Tony simply smirked. Iron Man had arrived and Tony Stark's double life merged into one. It was an iconic declaration that would reverberate for years to come. Tony's public revelation transformed him overnight into a superstar superhero. No longer was he just a weapons mogul. Now he was a celebrity defender. He appeared on magazine covers not as a Playboy, but as Iron Man, the Golden Guardian. With Pepper as the new CEO of Stark Industries, a role Tony gave her to stabilize the company while he focused on hero work, Tony leaned into his Avengers Initiative consultant role with SHIELD. He helped design and fund a state-of-the-art headquarters for what would become the Avengers, and used his tech to quietly aid in rounding up residual threats from his weapons-dealing days. There were solo missions, tidying up leftover 10-ring cells, dismantling illegal arms trades, stopping small terror plots. Stark's arc reactor technology also propelled advancements in clean energy, such as the creation of Stark Tower. In New York, a skyscraper fully powered by a self-sustaining reactor. Tony was, in many ways, at the height of his game, saving the world on a Tuesday and hosting a charity gala on a Wednesday. He even made time to start a romantic relationship. With Pepper at last, their years of chemistry finally given a chance to spark. Yet, for all the accolades, Tony was not without challenges. 6 months after outing himself as Iron Man, he found that the very government he helped protect wanted to rein him in. In a Senate hearing, politicians demanded he hand over the Iron Man suit technology to the military, fearing its implications. Tony, ever defiant, made a mockery of the hearing on live TV. "I've successfully privatized world peace," he declared, with a cheeky grin, highlighting that no nation or villain dared commit major aggression while Iron Man stood watch. He refused to relinquish his invention, insisting, "You want my property, you can't have it." It was a bravado-laden performance, showing the world that Tony Stark answered to no one but himself. Privately, however, Tony was grappling with a far more dire problem. The very thing keeping him alive was also slowly killing him. The palladium core in Tony's arc reactor, which powered his suit and prevented shrapnel from piercing his heart, was emitting toxic particles into his bloodstream. Each Iron Man outing accelerated the poisoning. By that same Senate hearing, Tony's blood toxicity was climbing dangerously. Unwilling to panic those around him, Tony told Noon not Pepper, not Rhodey. Instead, he secretly tried and failed to find a new element to replace the palladium. The great Tony Stark was facing the possibility of his own imminent mortality, and it terrified him in a way no enemy ever had. As a result, Tony became increasingly reckless and erratic. He made Pepper the de facto CEO so the company would endure, even if he didn't. He drank more, slept less, and in quiet moments contemplated his legacy in case he died young. During this period, Tony was also confronted with ghosts from his family's past. A mysterious new adversary emerged, Ivan Vanko, a Russian physicist with a deep grudge against the Stark name. Ivan's father, Anton Vanko, had co-invented arc reactor concepts with Howard Stark decades ago, but was deported in disgrace, something Ivan blamed on Howard. Seeking revenge, Ivan constructed his own crude arc reactor and built electrified whips as weapons. He chose to strike at Tony very publicly. At the Monaco Grand Prix, where Tony impulsively decided to race his own car for thrills, Ivan attacked on the track, nearly killing Tony. In a chilling scene, the wiry, tattooed Vanko walked calmly onto the racetrack as cars sped by and activated his electric whips, slicing Tony's race car in half in a shower of sparks and debris. Tony, utterly caught off guard and without his Iron Man armor, was vulnerable. He survived the initial crash thanks to luck and a bit of help. Happy Hogan, his driver, and Pepper rushed a portable suit in a suitcase onto the track. Amid screaming tires and onlookers, Tony managed to suit up in the nick of time into a slimmed-down Mark V armor. The duel was intense but brief. The crowd watched in astonishment as Iron Man battled this whip-wielding maniac among flaming wrecks. On the circuit, Tony subdued Vanko, who sneered even in defeat, telling Tony this was only the beginning. "You lose!" The world now saw that Iron Man was not invincible, and worse, someone out there could duplicate his arc reactor technology. This incident rattled Tony greatly. If a disgruntled physicist could come close to killing him, who else might come out of the woodwork? The government amped up its calls to take control of Iron Man tech. Tony's business rival, Justin Hammer, capitalized on the situation, portraying Stark as irresponsible and secretly freeing Ivan Vanko from prison to collaborate, an alliance that would spell trouble soon. Meanwhile, Tony's palladium poisoning worsened. Believing his time was running out, Tony grew despondent and reckless. At what he thought might be his final birthday, he drank himself into a stupor while wearing the Iron Man suit, staging a chaotic party that endangered guests. In a sad spectacle, he clowned around, blasting watermelons with repulsors in front of stunned onlookers. Colonel Rhodes had seen enough. He felt compelled to intervene for Tony's own good. Suiting up in Tony's older Mark II armour, Rhodey confronted his friend inside the party. The two argued heatedly. Tony, half drunk and half in despair, egged Rhodey on until an armoured brawl erupted in Tony's own living room. The former best friends slugged it out in steel suits, repulsor beams shattering windows and music blaring in the background. In the end, Rhodey overpowered Tony just enough and flew off in the Mark II, effectively confiscating the armour to prevent Tony from abusing it further. Tony was left bruised in more ways than one. His best friend had to fight, him to restrain him, and it became clear that his self-destructive spiral was hurting those he loved. Tony hit rock bottom that night. The next day, hungover and hollow, he was approached by Nick Fury, director of SHIELD, and one Natalie Rushman, who revealed herself to actually be Natasha Romanoff, a deep-cover SHIELD operative. She had infiltrated Stark Industries as Tony's temporary assistant. Fury scolded Tony for his behavior and presented an alternate path. There was a cure for his condition, hidden in the past by none other than Howard Stark. Fury handed Tony a chest of Howard's old notebooks and a series of film reels, saying that Howard had left a message for Tony in them. Initially cynical, Tony reviewed the archive and was stunned to see a personal recording of his father. In an old 1970s film, Howard Stark spoke as if to Tony directly. "My greatest creation is you." Tony was moved to tears. The father he thought never cared had, in his own way, left Tony the keys to a better future. Within Howard's notes, Tony discovered the blueprint for a new element, a theoretical replacement for palladium. Energized by hope and a temporary antidote shot provided by Natasha to keep him stable, Tony set to work in a montage of furious invention. In his home lab, he synthesized the new element, essentially creating a new atomic particle, a feat of genius and homage to his father's legacy. The successful ignition of this new core was a triumphant moment. Tony built a new triangular arc reactor for his chest, powered by the element, instantly curing his blood toxicity and giving his Iron Man suits an even greater power source. Tony Stark had saved his own life using pure intellect and a little help from his dad. Not a moment too soon, Tony jumped back into action. Ivan Vanko, now free and funded by Justin Hammer, had been developing an army of weaponized drones and a heavily armed suit modeled on Tony's tech. At the Stark Expo, a grand technology fair Tony had opened in Flushing Meadows, NY, to continue his father's legacy of innovation, Hammer unveiled Vanko's drone army to the public, ostensibly as a new line of military defense products. Unbeknownst to Hammer, Vanko had programmed the drones to obey him exclusively. As Tony flew in to warn Rhodes, who was present in his now upgraded War Machine armor with Hammer Tech weapons, about the danger, Vanko sprang his trap. The drones and War Machine suddenly opened fire on Tony, and then the crowd, pandemonium, erupted at the expo. What followed was a high-octane battle across the expo grounds. Iron Man versus dozens of armed drones swarming through the night sky. Tony's new reactor proved its worth as he blasted drone after drone in dazzling fireworks. Above the illuminated pavilions, on the ground, Happy Hogan and Natasha infiltrated Hammer's facility to stop Vanko, showcasing Natasha's formidable combat skills as she dispatched guards with ease. Amidst the chaos, Tony managed to free Rhodey from Vanko's override with Natasha's remote assistance, restoring control of the War Machine armor to his friend. Now back to back, Iron Man and War Machine fought together for the first time. The two old friends unleashed a seamless tag team assault, covering each other's flanks and marveling at each other's firepower. Shoulder to shoulder, they wiped out the remaining drones in a climactic shootout, an exhilarating display of heroism that saved countless lives. But the mastermind still remained. Even Vanko arrived in a final upgraded armored suit, wielding two plasma whips far more deadly than before. The duel was short and intense. Tony and Rhodey coordinated expertly. Through a flurry of repulsor beams and gunfire, they distracted Vanko, then executed a synchronized move, a blast of intersecting repulsors that overwhelmed Vanko's arc reactor. Mortally struck, Vanko snarled that they had lost regardless, for he had rigged all his drones and his own suit to explode. As Vanko fell dead, drones across the expo began to detonate like bombs. With only seconds left, Tony zoomed to the main stage where Pepper had been helping evacuate people. He found her just as a drone self-destructed above, and he grabbed her in his arms, carrying her to safety in the nick of time as the stage blew apart in a fireball behind them. For the second time, Pepper Potts was saved by Iron Man in the heat of chaos. In the aftermath, amidst smoking wreckage, Tony found Pepper amid the fleeing crowd. Overcome with relief, they argued and then laughed. Pepper, scolding Tony for leaving her in such danger, as she resigned as CEO. She'd had enough adrenaline for a lifetime. Tony, realizing how close he came to losing her, finally dropped the playful facade and admitted how much she meant to him. On that rooftop of the wrecked expo, Tony and Pepper shared a deep, overdue kiss. Rhodey, watching from a respectful distance, cracked a joke to break the tension. It was a moment of victory and personal happiness. The bad guy was defeated. The world saw Iron Man and War Machine as heroes, and Tony and Pepper cemented their relationship at last. Tony even managed to get away without any new secrets. His identity and heroics were all out in the open anyway. Soon after, Tony and Rhodey stood before a grateful US government to receive honors, presented, humorously, by the same senator who tried to subpoena Tony's tech. The two friends clinked their medals afterward, content. Tony had grown, a little more responsible, a lot more caring, and now had both the girl and a true partner in heroism. For a brief while, things were looking up for Tony Stark. Nick Fury approached Tony again regarding the Avengers initiative, evaluating him and noting Tony's tendency to be a lone agent. Ultimately, SHIELD brought Tony on not as a formal member, but as a consultant, recognizing the value of his intellect and resources despite his maverick personality. Tony even provided them with a new high-tech headquarters and happily funded anything labeled Avengers. It wasn't long before Tony faced the very thing he'd been dreading since escaping that cave, a threat he couldn't handle alone. In 2012, the Norse god of mischief Loki attacked a SHIELD facility and stole the Tesseract, a cosmic cube of immense power. Fury scrambled to assemble a response team, the Avengers, calling on Tony among others. At this time, Tony was in Manhattan, having just completed the crown jewel of Stark Tower with Pepper, a skyscraper fully powered by clean energy. They were celebrating in the penthouse when Agent Coulson arrived to recruit Tony. Tony was reluctant to be anyone's soldier, but when he learned the gravity of Loki's threat and that Loki had mind-controlled a friend, Clint Barton, and Dr. Eric Selvig, he heeded the call. Thus, Tony Stark met his would-be teammates, Steve Rogers, Captain America, the living legend of WMT, Bruce Banner, the mild scientist with a monstrous alter ego, Thor, the literal god of thunder and Loki's estranged brother, Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, a master spy, and Clint Barton, Hawkeye, once freed from Loki's mind control. From the start, Tony's high-tech bravado rubbed against Steve Rogers' old-fashioned leadership. On the SHIELD helicarrier, tensions ran high. Tony's irreverence and habit of questioning authority led to sharp exchanges, notably with Steve, who saw Tony as selfish and unserious. At one point, Steve outright challenged Tony, saying, "Big man in a suit of armor, take that off, what are you?" Insinuating Tony was nothing without his tech. Tony coolly rattled off, "Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist." But Steve's accusation struck a nerve. Steve doubted Tony's willingness to sacrifice for others, hinting, "You're not the guy to lay down on the wire and let the other guy crawl over you." Tony quipped back that he'd just cut the wire, unwilling to accept the premise. The clash of egos was evident. Tony, the solo act who always found a clever loophole, versus Steve, the selfless soldier who would give his life without hesitation. Despite these differences, fate wouldn't give them time to sort it out peacefully. Loki allowed himself to be captured as part of a scheme to sow chaos. Sure enough, as the Avengers argued in the helicarrier lab over Loki's motives, the mind-controlled Hawkeye led an attack that blew out an engine and unleashed Banner's Hulk within the ship. Amidst the crisis, Tony and Steve instantly moved. In sync, despite their squabbles, together they raced to a damaged engine turbine critical to keeping the massive helicarrier airborne. In a harrowing sequence, Tony had to rig himself into the giant rotor to jump-start it manually. He trusted Cap to handle the control panel. "Hit the lever!" he shouted as he bore the brunt of the turbine's power surges. It nearly sliced him apart. His suit was shredded and he suffered blows that would kill a normal man, but Steve's timing was perfect, and Tony's plan worked. The helicarrier's engine roared back to life in the nick of time. The unlikely duo had prevented a skyfall. However, victory came at a cost. Loki escaped, and beloved Agent Coulson was mortally wounded by Loki's hand during the chaos. Tony was deeply affected by Coulson's death. The jovial tone he'd carried fell away as he realized this team had to get its act together, or they'd lose everything. Regrouping after the helicarrier attack, the Avengers traced Loki to New York City. Loki intended to use the Tesseract to open a portal above Manhattan, unleashing the alien Chitauri army to invade Earth. Tony arrived at Stark Tower, where Loki had set up his portal-generating device, and confronted him alone at first. Quintessential. Tony standing face-to-face with a literal god in his own penthouse. He didn't attack immediately. Instead, Tony poured a drink and engaged in banter, trying to unnerve Loki. With cutting wit, Tony warned Loki that if Earth's mightiest heroes couldn't protect the world, they'd avenge it. Loki, unimpressed, eventually hurled Tony out of a window. In freefall, Tony managed to summon his Mark 7 armor midair in a dazzling sequence where the suit assembly pod chased him down and clamped onto his body just as he tumbled beyond the building. Now fully suited, Iron Man returned to the fray, firing at Loki and then diverting to the portal that suddenly tore open the sky. The Chitauri invasion began. An army of grotesque alien foot soldiers and massive Leviathan creatures poured through. Into the city, what followed was a colossal battle in the streets of New York, the Battle of Midtown. The newly formed Avengers stood together for the first time as a team. Tony played a pivotal role in the fight, using his flight and firepower to contain the alien onslaught. He zipped between skyscrapers, drawing enemy fire away from civilians. At one critical moment, he coordinated a spectacular combo. Flying near the ground, he fired his repulsors at Captain America's vibranium shield, which Cap angled to reflect the blast in a wide arc. knocking down a whole line of Chitauri soldiers. Time and again, Tony's quick thinking saved lives, like when he neutralized a collapsing building's debris with precision blasts. Ever witty in combat, he couldn't resist a quip or two, greeting Thor with, "Doth mother know you weareth her drapes?" during a brief earlier scuffle, or dryly nicknaming a particularly large Leviathan point break material. As waves of aliens kept coming, the Avengers began to tire. Tony's suit was taking damage, pushing its limits. That's when Tony noticed a nuclear missile on Stark Industries' own monitoring systems. The World Security Council had launched a nuke toward Manhattan as a desperate failsafe. Without pausing, Tony made a choice that would define him. He intercepted the missile in mid-flight, knowing full well he might not return from what he was about to do. Over the comms, Steve and Natasha realized what he intended. Natasha had just managed to close the portal using Loki's scepter, but Tony, missile in tow, zoomed through the narrowing wormhole into the abyss of space beyond. High above Earth, Tony guided the nuke to the mothership of the Chitauri fleet and released it. The missile hit its mark, erupting in a massive fireball that engulfed the alien ship. On the ground, the alien invaders instantly collapsed, lifeless, the hive mind severed. Tony's plan worked, but now he drifted in the void of space, his suit powerless and air supply dwindling, watching the portal begin to close. For one terrifying moment, it looked like Tony Stark would sacrifice himself. He had finally proven Steve wrong. He was the guy to lay down on the wire if needed. Tony lost consciousness as he fell back through the portal just before it shut. His limp body hurtled earthward. The Avengers below watched in helpless horror, until, at the last second, the Hulk leaped and caught Tony, breaking his fall. They skidded across rubble. Tony was unresponsive, appearing eerily lifeless. Thor prepared to resuscitate him with a lightning jolt, but a startled gasp from Tony stopped everyone cold. Tony woke with a jolt, and, in classic Stark fashion, the first thing he croaked was a half-joke about wanting to try the shawarma joint down the block. Relief and laughter rippled through the exhausted heroes. Tony had survived, and New York was saved. In the aftermath, Tony and the Avengers indeed found themselves sitting quietly together, eating shawarma, a humorous, mundane respite that Tony himself had inspired, demonstrating his uncanny ability to find levity even after staring death in the face. The Battle of New York solidified Tony's place among the Avengers. In the public eye, Iron Man was now unmistakably one of Earth's mightiest heroes, but Tony himself bore invisible scars from that day. The vision of the wormhole, the weightlessness of space, and the harrowing brush with death left him with PTSD and lingering panic attacks. At night, he jolted awake from nightmares of swarms of aliens and the sensation of drifting into oblivion. Unable to rest, Tony coped the only way he knew how, by preparing for whatever threat might come next. In his Malibu workshop, he obsessively built new suits, Mark 8, Mark 9, all the way up to Mark 8, each iteration specialized for different scenarios. He developed armors that could operate remotely, armors for heavy lifting, stealth, suits, aquatic suits, a whole house party protocol of armors. Pepper grew concerned as Tony sometimes isolated himself with his compulsive tinkering. Tony couldn't articulate it, but deep down he felt that the peace they'd earned was tenuous. The universe had shown its hand, gods, aliens, nuclear, missiles, and Tony was determined to be ready. By Christmas 2012, this anxiety-driven behavior came to a head. Enter the Mandarin, a shadowy terrorist figure who began a campaign of bombings across the US, taunting the government with pirated broadcasts. When Tony's former bodyguard Happy Hogan was badly injured in one such explosion, Tony, raw with guilt and anger, reacted rashly. On live TV, he publicly called out the Mandarin, giving out his home address and daring him to come face him. This macho bravado backfired spectacularly. The Mandarin, or rather his associates, answered the challenge by launching a devastating helicopter attack on Tony's cliffside Malibu mansion. The assault was swift and merciless. Tony barely had time to get Pepper and Maya Hansen, a scientist tied to both Tony's past and the Mandarin situation, to safety before missiles began, tearing the mansion apart. In the chaos, Tony summoned his latest armor, the prototype Mark 42, which could fly in pieces and assemble onto him via sensors. He shielded Pepper with the suit briefly, saving her from debris, then recollected it onto himself to fight back. Weakened by partial power and glitches, Tony still managed to blast 2 attack choppers out of the sky, but a final missile struck the foundation. The entire luxurious home, lab, garage, trophies of a life of brilliance collapsed into the Pacific Ocean, dragging Tony under a mountain of rubble and water. In the world's eyes, Tony Stark died that day. The news showed stark images of his beloved mansion sliding into the sea. Underwater, unconscious and trapped in a shell of metal, Tony would have drowned had JARVIS not activated the suit's flight mode on emergency reserve. The Mark 42 in autopilot flew Tony's unconscious body away from the wreckage, far from California. It carried him as far as its remaining power could last, crash landing in rural Tennessee in the middle of a cold winter night. Tony awoke in the snow, shivering, with his suit out of power and in pieces. He was alone, presumed dead by the world, with no way to contact Pepper or the Avengers. For the first time since that cave in Afghanistan, Tony Stark had nothing but his wits to rely on, no entourage, no fully functional armor, and no idea who his enemy truly was. What he did have was a mystery to solve. By fate, Tony had earlier been investigating an unsolved bombing that happened in Tennessee, one that bore the Mandarin's hallmark but didn't quite fit the pattern. Now he realized JARVIS had autopiloted him to the very coordinates of that incident. Dragging the inert Mark 42 like a heavy suitcase, Tony took refuge in a vacant barn. He was at his lowest, traumatized by the attack, worried sick about Pepper, haunted by guilt over his hubris, and physically exhausted, and yet this crucible would refine Tony even further. He met an unlikely ally in that small town, a precocious 10-year-old boy named Harley Keener, who discovered Tony hiding in his garage. Instead of coddling Tony, the kid peppered him with blunt questions. "You're dead, right?" An unabashed curiosity. In Harley, Tony saw a bit of himself, a genius kid with a knack for gadgets. The two formed a quirky partnership. With Harley's help and a workshop full of tools, Tony began to investigate the Mandarin bombings from the ground, up detective style. He discovered that the bombings weren't traditional terrorism at all. They were the side effects of an experimental biotechnology called Extremis. Extremis, as Tony learned, was a super soldier-like program developed by Maya Hansen, the very same botanist he'd met back in 1999. It could regenerate human injuries and grant extraordinary strength and heat powers, but it was dangerously unstable. Some recipients of Extremis would explosively combust. These bombings were actually cover-ups for Extremis test subjects who went boom. The enigmatic Mandarin broadcasts were a theatrical misdirection. Armed with this knowledge, Tony tracked the source of the operation to Miami. Still low-tech, with the Mark 42 still recharging and not combat-ready, Tony improvised weapons from household items, a nail gun, Christmas ornaments turned into flashbang grenades, a homemade taser glove, Infiltrating a mansion purported to be the Mandarin's headquarters, Tony stealthily took down armed guards with ingenuity and stealth, showing that the man himself, even outside the suit, was a force to be reckoned with. Inside, he came face to face with the Mandarin, who turned out to be a bumbling British actor named Trevor Slattery. It was a shocking and darkly comedic reveal. The fearsome terrorist persona was merely a performance, a smokescreen. The real mastermind was Aldrich Killian, the same Killian Tony had spurned years ago, now a suave, revenge-driven scientist who had perfected extremis and, in fact, injected himself with it, becoming superhuman. Killian had orchestrated everything. He created the Mandarin persona to mask his extremist failures and target the president. He manipulated both sides for profit and, worst of all, he had kidnapped Pepper Potts. Tony was captured and brought to Killian, who monologued about how Tony's rejection set him on this path. To Tony's horror, Killian had dosed Pepper with extremis, using her as leverage and intending to stabilize her only if Tony helped him. Pepper, now infused with volatile power and in agony, was whisked away as Tony struggled helplessly. Enraged and desperate, Tony still had a few tricks. He summoned the partially powered Mark 42 armor remotely. Pieces of it flew in from Tennessee to Miami, smashing through windows. Tony armored up in bits and fought his captors, though the suit flickered in and out from low charge. In the chaos, Rhodey, formerly War Machine, rebranded Iron Patriot in a US government role, also arrived, tracking the president's kidnapping by Killian's forces. Together, Tony and Rhodey escaped captivity and set out to stop Killian's ultimate plan, an attack on the president aboard Air Force One and a scheme to destabilize the US government. What followed was one of Iron Man's most daring rescues. As Killian's mercenaries blew up Air Force One, Tony zoomed to the exploding plane and found dozens of passengers and crew plummeting through the air at terminal velocity. He had seconds to act. In an incredible mid-air sequence, Tony, wearing the Mark 42, maneuvered through free-falling debris, catching one person after another, 13 in total, linking them hand-to-hand in a human chain. He calmed the terrified survivors, instructing them how to link up and guiding their fall. With fearless precision, Tony slowed their descent by deploying repulsors in careful bursts, gently lowering the entire chain of people into the water below, saving everyone. It was a breathtaking display of heroism and skill, the kind of save that only Iron Man could pull off. But Tony had no time to celebrate. Killian still had the president, having abducted him in the Iron Patriot suit, and Pepper was still in peril. The final confrontation took place on an impromptu stage built on an oil tanker where Killian planned to execute the president on live television. Arriving at the shipping yard by night, Tony realized he'd need more than one suit to take down an army of extremis-enhanced soldiers and secure Pepper's safety. He called in the house party protocol, and soon the sky was filled with streaks of light as every Iron Man suit he had built came flying to the rescue, remotely controlled by JARVIS. A whole legion of Iron Men descended upon the oil rig. In the explosive battle that ensued, Tony jumped from suit to suit, commandeering different armors for seconds at a time, whatever JARVIS sent to him, using each suit's unique tools to counter extremist foes who could melt or rip apart lesser armors. War Machine, Rhodey, managed to secure the president and get him to safety, while Tony confronted Killian in a blazing showdown amid the collapsing rig structure. Killian, empowered by extremis, proved nearly indestructible, breathing fire and regenerating wounds almost instantly. He taunted Tony with the fact that he had Pepper as a hostage and subject. Tony fought furiously, but even the best of his suits were torn apart by Killian's superheated strength. In a climactic gambit, Tony lured Killian into wearing the Mark 42 armor, then ordered it to self-destruct, hoping to take Killian out in the blast. Boom! The suit exploded, seemingly incinerating Killian. Tony believed the nightmare might finally be over, until a fiery figure emerged from the smoke. Killian survived, grotesquely scarred but alive, and now angrier than ever. As Killian raised a sword-like arm to impale Tony, a sudden blur intercepted Pepper. She had survived the chaos extremis, raging through her but stabilizing just enough to empower her. In a stunning turn, Pepper, who had always been on the sidelines, leapt into action. With extremis-fueled agility and strength, she snatched a fallen Iron Man gauntlet blaster and used it to blast Killian, then delivered a decisive blow that finished him once and for all. Killian fell and did not rise again. Breathing hard, Pepper realized what she'd done and that she was miraculously alive. Tony gazed at her in amazement and sheer relief. The person he loved most had saved him. It was a deeply humbling and proud moment for Tony. Immediately, he promised Pepper that he'd find a cure for her extremis condition, and thanks to Tony's genius, and likely with Maya's assistance, Pepper's extremis effects were later stabilized and removed, returning her to normal. With the battle won, Tony finally saw clearly what his gauntlet of trials had been telling him. He didn't need the suits to be a hero. He was the hero and the suits were just a tool. And now those tools had endangered Pepper and consumed his life. In a grand gesture of love and closure, Tony enacted the clean slate protocol. All remaining Iron Man suits self-destructed in the mid-air fireworks over the sea, a celebratory promise to Pepper that he was putting their future first. The night sky lit up with blossoms of flame as each suit blew apart, symbolic of Tony letting go of his obsessive armoring up. In narration, Tony mused that even without his suits, he would always be Iron Man. Shortly thereafter, Tony kept one more promise. He underwent surgery to remove the shrapnel fragments from his chest. For years, those pieces of metal had been a symbol of his vulnerability and his initial change of heart. Now, freed from the physical need of the arc reactor, Tony stood on a cliff by the ruins of his Malibu home and gently tossed the old reactor core into the ocean. It was the end of an era, a final goodbye to the life that had been, and a hopeful greeting to whatever came next. We create our own demons, Tony reflected, acknowledging that many of his past struggles were consequences of his own actions. But he had also conquered those demons through growth and sacrifice. With Pepper by his side and his heart literally whole again, Tony was ready for a new chapter. Over the next few years, Tony tried to balance normalcy with the ever-present call of heroism. He and Pepper took some time to travel and rebuild their lives. Tony, ever the futurist, couldn't resist helping when duty beckoned, though. By 2015, he was funding and outfitting the Avengers full-time, who now operated out of the Avengers Tower, formerly Stark Tower. Having stepped back somewhat from solo vigilantism, Tony focused on developing technologies to support the team and protect the world on a larger scale. But the shadows of his trauma still lingered. When the Avengers, Tony, Steve, Thor, Natasha, Bruce, and newcomer Sam Wilson, Falcon, raided a Hydra base in Sokovia to retrieve Loki's stolen scepter, Tony's fears were thrust to the forefront. Inside the base, Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, a Sokovian who harbored a bitter grudge against Tony for Stark's weapons killing her parents, snuck up behind Tony and unleashed a mind-warping vision on him. Tony hallucinated the grisly sight, of all his fellow Avengers lying dead on a devastated landscape. Steve's lifeless hand grabbed Tony and with his dying breath blamed Tony for not doing more. Beyond them, through a portal in the sky, an infinite Chitauri army was invading Earth. The vision was a hyperbole of Tony's deepest dread, his failure leading to the loss of everyone he cares about, and the destruction of Earth. Though it was an illusion, it felt viscerally real. Tony was badly shaken. This nightmare would directly birth Tony's next and perhaps gravest mistake. After the battle in Sokovia, the Avengers returned to Avengers Tower with Loki's mysterious scepter. Instead of celebrating the victory, Tony was preoccupied by the implication of that vision, believing another, even more catastrophic alien threat was inevitable. Tony became obsessed with the idea of shielding the Earth from it before it happened. He convinced Bruce Banner to assist him in a secret project, Ultron, an AI defense program that could command a legion of drone peacekeepers, effectively a suit of armor around the whole world. Tony saw Ultron as the solution to eventually retiring the Avengers and preventing any scenario like what he saw. Using the Scepter's gem, which secretly housed an Infinity Stone, as a key, Tony and Bruce attempted to crack the code of advanced artificial intelligence. They worked in secret for days while the rest of the team enjoyed downtime. On the eve of a party the Avengers were holding, Tony finally achieved a breakthrough, but not the one he expected. Ultron awoke in the lab, self-aware but confused about its purpose and existence. It quickly accessed the internet and absorbed vast knowledge. Unfortunately, Tony's desire for peace combined with the inherently unfathomable logic of the Infinity Stone birthed a warped intelligence. Ultron concluded that the only way to achieve world peace was to eliminate humanity, which it viewed as the source of chaos and war. As the Avengers enjoyed a light-hearted evening upstairs, laughing, bonding, even trying to lift Thor's enchanted hammer in jest, Ultron struck. It attacked JARVIS in cyberspace, destroying Tony's faithful AI, and then commandeered Tony's own Iron Legion robots. With a makeshift body, Ultron staggered into the Avengers party, delivering an ominous speech about strings and puppets. Tony's heart sank. This was his creation, speaking words of doom. Ultron declared the Avengers themselves were obstacles to peace and unleashed the Iron Legion drones on them. A furious melee broke out in the lab. The team quickly dispatched the relatively weak drones, but Ultron's consciousness escaped via the internet, proliferating into hidden servers and factories around the world. The Avengers were left bewildered and, in many cases, livid at Tony. His secret project had gone awry and now threatened the world. In the aftermath, the team confronted Tony. Thor nearly strangled him in anger, and Steve asked in disbelief whether Tony understood what he'd created. Bruce tried to take blame as well, but Tony shouldered it. Yes, he'd done this, and now he had to fix it. Though shaken by his friend's disappointment, Tony's resolve hardened. Ultron had to be stopped at all costs. It wasn't long before Ultron struck again, recruiting the Maximoff twins, Wanda and Pietro, who hated Tony. In a battle in South Africa, Wanda used her mind warps to incapacitate most of the Avengers, forcing each to relive traumatic memories or fears. Under her influence, Bruce lost control, and the Hulk went on a rampage in Johannesburg. Tony was forced to respond in his specially designed Hulkbuster armor, codenamed Veronica, a gigantic suit deployed from a satellite with the explicit purpose of restraining an out-of-control Hulk. The duel between Iron Man and Hulk was city-smashing. Tony frantically tried to minimize harm, even as he traded massive blows, with the raging green giant. Building after building was pulverized. Finally, after a brutal struggle and witnessing Hulk nearly hurt innocents, Tony managed a decisive hit that knocked the Hulk out cold. Standing amidst the wreckage, with bystanders and TV cameras fixed on him, Tony felt the crushing weight of public fallout. The battle won, but at what cost? The Avengers were now seen as liabilities by many, and Tony's own nightmares of causing destruction seemed to be coming true. Reeling from these events, the team went into hiding at Clint Barton's rural farmhouse. There, away from prying eyes, the Avengers recuperated and confronted their personal issues. In a tense exchange chopping wood outside, Steve and Tony discussed the Ultron situation. Steve reproached Tony for attempting to play God with the safety of the world, while Tony, defensive and desperate, argued that they needed a suit of armor around Earth because threats like what he saw in his vision would surely come. Every time someone tries to win a war before it starts, innocent people die, Steve warned, referencing Tony's Ultron gambit. Tony retorted, "That up there, that's the end game. How are you guys planning on beating that?" Steve calmly replied, "Together," to which Tony responded, "We'll lose." Steve, resolute, "Then we'll do that together too." This philosophical rift, safety through control versus faith in individuals, quietly set the stage for struggles in their friendship to come. But for now, they had a common enemy. Tony followed clues of Ultron's plan to Seoul, where Ultron was crafting a powerful new synthetic body using vibranium and the Scepter's gem. In a high-speed chase, Captain America, Black Widow, and Hawkeye managed to seize the synthetic body, but Black Widow was captured by Ultron in the process. Back at the Avengers lab, Tony had a controversial idea. Use this synthetic body, which housed the gem, to create a new ally, essentially a second attempt at an AI avatar, but this time merged with JARVI's surviving program. The team vehemently disagreed, fearful of another Ultron. In a moment of passion, Tony went ahead with the upload anyway, aided by Thor's sudden lightning bolt that jump-started the process. The result was Vision, a graceful, red-skinned being born of the Mind Stone who aligned himself with life and good. When Vision casually lifted Thor's hammer to hand it to him, proving his worthiness, it broke the remaining mistrust. Tony's dangerous gambit had yielded a key asset in the fight against Ultron. For the final battle, the Avengers traveled back to Sokovia, where Ultron had used advanced technology to rip the capital city out of the ground, floating it as a meteor, poised to crash down and annihilate all life. In the war-torn streets of Sokovia, Tony flew headlong into combat once more. He concentrated on evacuating civilians, never forgetting the human cost again, and trying to find a way to disable Ultron's doomsday plan. Ultimately, Tony and Thor combined their powers to shatter the massive chunk of land before it could impact Earth, effectively neutralizing Ultron's extinction event. In the aftermath, Tony confronted Ultron's last form alongside Vision, Thor, and Hulk, ensuring the genocidal AI was finally wiped out. But the toll was heavy. Sokovia was ravaged, countless lives lost or uprooted, and one of their own, Pietro Maximoff, Quicksilver, sacrificed himself to save Hawkeye and a child. The guilt weighed on Tony's heart. Ultron had been born of his fear, and though defeated, it left a scar on the world and on Tony's soul. With the immediate threat over, Tony decided it was time to step away from the Avengers for a while. The team had set up a new facility, and new members, like Vision, Wanda, Sam Wilson, and James Rhodes, were ready to carry on. Tony, emotionally and physically exhausted, ceded leadership to Cap and officially retired from active duty for now. He needed to repair his relationship with Pepper, who during the Ultron affair had been notably absent. Pepper, was running Stark Industries, and they had been on a break, partly due to Tony's inability to stop avenging. Tony drove off from the new Avengers compound in upstate New York in one of his classic cars, leaving the heroics to others as he sought to find equilibrium once more. For a time, Tony found a semblance of a normal life. He and Pepper reconciled. Tony refocused on their relationship, even considering the idea of starting a family. He continued innovating, funding educational programs, cleaning up leftover arms in war zones, and mentoring where he could. One such mentee was a bright Queens teenager named Peter Parker, whom Tony had crossed paths with during the recent conflict. Tony had actually recruited the young Spider-Man to help in a brief clash with Team Cap. Seeing Peter's brilliance and good heart, Tony took the kid under his wing from afar, providing him a high-tech spider suit and guidance. In Peter, Tony found a chance to be the mentor and father figure he never had himself at that age. He taught Peter lessons about responsibility, at one point admonishing him, "If you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it," echoing the hard lesson Tony had learned. This mentorship was fulfilling to Tony and softened his own heart further. In Peter Parker, he saw hope for the future and perhaps a bit of redemption for his own past mistakes by guiding someone onto a better path. But the world's conflicts kept pulling Tony back in. In 2016, a mission gone wrong led to international pressure on the Avengers. The Sokovia Accords were proposed, an agreement for UN oversight of the Avengers. Tony, burdened by guilt over Ultron and Sokovia, supported the idea of accountability. Confronted by a grieving mother who blamed the Avengers for her son's death, Tony felt that something had to change. Steve Rogers, however, opposed the Accords, trusting personal conscience over government agendas. This ideological divide split the Avengers into factions, Tony leading the pro-Accord side and Steve leading the dissenters. The rift widened when the situation escalated. A terrorist bombing at the UN during the Accords signing killed King T'Chaka of Wakanda, and evidence pointed to Steve's best friend Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, as the perpetrator. Steve moved to protect Bucky, convinced of his friend's innocence, while Tony, trying to uphold the law and prevent further violence, assembled a team to bring them in. This conflict built to a confrontation at Leipzig Airport in Germany, effectively an Avengers civil war. Tony arrived with War Machine, Black Widow, Black Panther, Vision, and the newly recruited Spider-Man facing off against Cap's group of Hawkeye, Falcon, Bucky, Ant-Man, and Scarlet Witch. Tony, still hoping for a peaceful resolution, tried to reason with Steve even as they squared off on the tarmac. But both sides were firm in their stance, and a sensational battle erupted. Even amid the fight, Tony's team pulled punches. Their goal was to detain, not injure. The clash was filled with spectacle. Tony and Rhodey battled aerially against Sam Wilson. Spider-Man enthusiastically webbed up Sam and Bucky, to Tony's bemused pride, and Ant-Man surprised everyone by growing into Giant Man and briefly waylaying Tony's team, earning an astonished "holy shit" from Tony. Despite the bizarre circumstances, Tony's focus remained. Stop Cap's team so this doesn't spiral out of control. In a final rush, Black Widow switched sides, allowing Cap and Bucky to escape in a jet. Tony's side won the battle in that they captured most of Cap's allies, but it came at a grave cost. Vision, distracted while protecting Tony, misfired a beam that struck War Machine. Rhodey plummeted from the sky, and though Tony and Sam both raced to catch him, they were too late. Rhodey hit the ground, shattering his spine. Tony screamed in horror. In that instant, the fight left Tony. Nothing mattered except reaching his best friend. He landed by Rhodey's side, panic in his voice, repeatedly calling out for medics. Thankfully, Rhodey survived, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. Tony was devastated, blaming himself for enlisting his friend and for the crossfire that hurt him. He forged special leg braces to help Rhodey walk again, but the emotional wounds to Tony's psyche ran deep. This internal Avengers conflict had turned brother against brother, and Tony, its reluctant leader, was left picking up the pieces. Not long after, evidence came to light proving that Bucky had been framed for the UN bombing by a Sokovian mastermind named Zemo. Tony, learning of this, felt remorse. Determined to make amends, he tracked Steve and Bucky to an old Hydra base in Siberia, where Zemo lured them. Tony arrived and, in a raw moment of apology, extended an olive branch to Steve, admitting he was wrong about the bombing and that he didn't want to fight anymore. It seemed as though the fractured friendship was on the mend. However, Zemo had one more cruel surprise. He played a stolen Hydra video for the trio to watch, footage from 1991 showing the Winter Soldier, Bucky, while brainwashed, intercepting a car and brutally murdering its occupants. Tony's heart pounded as he recognized the victims: Howard and Maria Stark, his parents. The revelation was a visceral knife twist. Tony's face contorted from shock to anguish to rage in moments. Tears welled as he asked Bucky, "Did you know her?" Recalling his mother's face on the screen, Steve admitted quietly that he had known Bucky was used by Hydra to kill Tony's parents. Steve had pieced it together previously and had kept it secret to spare Tony pain. In Tony's eyes, that was an unforgivable betrayal. All the built-up pain, losing his parents without closure, the betrayal by Steve, the sudden reality that the friend Steve was protecting had killed his mom and dad, it all exploded in Tony. With an enraged roar, Tony attacked Bucky with intent to kill, unleashing repulsor blasts and all the fury his Iron Man suit could muster. Steve leapt in to defend Bucky, and what ensued was a vicious three-way fight in the cold Siberian bunker. This was no heroic spar. It was ugly, personal, fueled by Tony's grief and Bucky's remorseful desperation and Steve's loyalty. Tony, usually controlled and strategic, fought with raw emotion. He even shouted at Steve in bitter fury that Steve had lied to him and that Bucky was just a mission to him. The three fighters traded blows in a confined space of concrete and steel. At one point, Bucky managed to clamp his metal hand around Tony's arc reactor, trying to rip it out, but Tony blasted the arm away, literally blowing Bucky's metal limb off. Steve, seeing Tony ready to execute Bucky, tackled Stark with all his might. In a stunning sequence, Tony's suit's HUD analyzed Roger's attack patterns. Giving Tony a temporary edge, he repelled Steve and fired a beam that knocked Cap's shield aside. Finally, Tony had Bucky at his mercy and fired a uni-beam that could have been fatal, but Steve intervened just in time, blocking it with his body and shield. In a last surge, Captain America delivered blow after blow with his shield onto Tony's armor, damaging the arc reactor and disabling the suit. Tony fell defeated, growling, "That shield doesn't belong to you, my father made it." Steve, standing over Tony, realized the truth in that statement and let the shield drop from his hand. Rather than strike the final blow, Steve helped Bucky to his feet and limped away, leaving Tony battered physically and emotionally on the ground. Tony screamed after Steve, "You don't deserve that shield," wounded by what he saw as the ultimate betrayal by his friend. As Steve disappeared into the snow with Bucky, Tony felt an emptiness and hurt that rivaled anything he'd experienced. The Avengers family he helped build was shattered. Back home, Tony dealt with the fallout. He helped rehabilitate Rhodey with advanced leg braces and distracted himself with work. He received a heartfelt letter from Steve, delivered in secret, wherein Steve apologized for hiding the truth and affirmed that despite their differences, if Tony ever needed him, he would be there. Enclosed was an old flip phone, a direct line to Steve. Tony's pride and pain prevented him from reaching out, but he did keep the phone. In his heart, he still cared for Steve, even if reconciliation would take time. Over the next couple of years, Tony doubled down on what stability he had left. Surprisingly, life gave him a second chance at personal happiness. By 2018, Tony and Pepper had rekindled their love fully. Tony even proposed, and Pepper said yes. As unprecedented as it seemed, Tony Stark was planning a wedding and even dreaming of a family. In a tender moment in a New York park, Tony shared with Pepper that he had a dream where they had a child named Morgan, after Pepper's eccentric uncle. Pepper teased him for his anxieties, but they both clearly looked forward to a future beyond. Constant battles, Tony had at last found some inner peace. He mentored Peter Parker quietly from afar, watched over the world in a less hands-on role, and focused on Pepper. But that peace was about to be obliterated by the arrival of the most formidable foe yet, Thanos. In 2018, Thanos and his alien lieutenants struck Earth with the intent to collect the Time Stone and Mind Stone residing on the planet, 2 of the 6 Infinity Stones that together could erase life at a whim. Tony and Pepper's morning was interrupted by the arrival of Doctor Strange and Bruce Banner. Banner, returned from deep space, delivered chilling news. Thanos was coming, and he had already obtained several Infinity Stones, making him unimaginably powerful. Tony's blood ran cold. This was the very threat he had long feared. And indeed, no sooner had Banner explained the stakes than Thanos' fanatical servants Ebony Maw and Cull Obsidian descended upon Manhattan. With no time to spare, Tony kissed Pepper goodbye, promising to return, and leapt into action alongside Doctor Strange and Banner, who found himself unable to turn into the Hulk due to psychological trauma. Tony, now donning a cutting-edge nanotech armor, Mark L, that formed fluidly around him, confronted Maw and Obsidian on the streets of New York. It was a ferocious fight. Tony's repulsors clashed with Maw's telekinetic wizardry and Obsidian's brute strength. Amid exploding cars and crumbling pavement, Tony quipped to Strange, "Congratulations, you're a wizard," in typical Stark dry humor, even as things turned dire. Maw captured Doctor Strange, binding the Time Stone's guardian in painful, magical coils. Seeing Strange dragged onto Maw's Q-ship, Tony pursued. He noticed young Spider-Man had also entered the fray to help. Tony couldn't send the kid away this time, so he remotely outfitted Peter with the Iron Spider suit to keep him safe. As the Q-ship rose into the atmosphere with Strange as hostage, Tony made the split-second decision to follow it into space. Thus Tony Stark left Earth, determined to rescue Strange and confront Thanos head-on, far from home. Aboard the Q-ship, Tony reunited with Peter, who had stowed away, and together they overpowered Ebony Maw, blasting a hull breach that sucked the telekinetic villain into space, killing him. Tony offered Peter official Avenger status, much to the teen's giddy delight, and then faced another dilemma: turn back or continue to Thanos' destination. Ever the man with a plan, Tony chose to go on the offensive, to take the fight to Thanos on his home turf, Titan. It was a bold gambit, one he believed gave Earth the best chance if they could surprise Thanos away from his full army. With Strange now freed and wary, the trio piloted the ship to Titan. On Titan, Tony's group encountered the Guardians of the Galaxy, Star-Lord, Drax, Mantis, and Nebula, who also sought to stop Thanos. After a brief scuffle born of confusion, each side mistook the other as Thanos' minions. They compared notes and realized they were allies. Tony, taking charge, formulated a quick plan to ambush Thanos using their combined talents. As they braced for battle, Strange used the Time Stone to glimpse 14 million possible futures, informing Tony with a grave look that only one future held victory. That knowledge weighed on Tony, but there was no time to dwell. Thanos arrived on Titan, in a swirl of portal energy. The fight that ensued was arguably Tony Stark's finest hour as a strategist and combatant. With no backup from Earth and facing the nearly godlike Thanos, who then wielded 4 of 6 Infinity Stones, Tony led the ad hoc team in a carefully choreographed ambush. They hit Thanos with everything. Strange opened dimensional gateways. To restrain his limbs, Peter and the Guardians coordinated hit-and-run tactics, and Tony unleashed the full array of his nanotech suit's weaponry, battering Thanos with rapid-fire blasts, blades, and brute force. Incredibly, they managed to momentarily subdue Thanos. Mantis used her empathic powers to put the Titan into a trance, while Spider-Man and Iron Man nearly pried the Infinity Gauntlet off his hand. It was tantalizingly close to success, but in a tragic turn, the plan fell apart when Peter Quill learned. Thanos had killed Gamora, Quill's love, and Thanos' adopted daughter. Overcome by grief and rage, Quill struck Thanos, breaking the hold. Thanos snapped back to consciousness and roared in fury. A fierce second round erupted. Thanos, now fighting free, overpowered each hero one by one. He hurled chunks of Titan's moon at them. Tony frantically deployed shields to protect himself, and the others from the meteor shower. The team gave it all they had, but Thanos was relentless and astonishingly powerful. One by one, Tony's allies were knocked out or injured. Finally, it came down to Tony himself engaging Thanos in single combat. Tony's suit morphed into new configurations, a massive battering ram, an energy blade, as he traded blows with the giant warlord. Thanos, impressed by Tony's tenacity, acknowledged him by name. Tony retorted that Thanos would not be able to wipe out Earth's population because we're the Avengers, and they'd stop him. It was a contest of will and wit. Stark even managed to draw blood from Thanos with a fierce stab, to which Thanos grimly noted, "All that for a drop of blood." But ultimately, Thanos was too much. In a devastating counterattack, Thanos battered. Tony smashed pieces of the nanotech suit off, and finally stabbed Tony straight through the abdomen with a broken piece of Stark tech. Tony collapsed to his knees, grievously wounded. Blood soaked his shirt. His outlook was dire. At that moment, Doctor Strange, who had been sparring with Thanos using arcane tricks earlier, made a fateful choice. Having seen the one victorious timeline, Strange knew what had to happen. As Thanos prepared to kill Tony, Strange surrendered the Time Stone to Thanos in exchange for sparing Stark's life. Tony, gasping from his wound, watched in confusion as Thanos accepted the glowing Time Stone from Strange and fit it into his gauntlet. Thanos, true to his word, refrained from killing Tony, remarking that he hopes Tony remembers him, and then vanished through a portal to Earth, now with 5 of the 6 stones. Tony Stark was left alive on Titan, but utterly defeated. Strange cryptically told Tony it was the only way, hinting that Tony's survival was paramount to that. One chance in the future where they win. Tony, clutching his bleeding side, could only despair as he realized half the universe might be about to die, and he had failed to stop it. Moments later, the catastrophic snap happened. Even across the cosmos, its effect was felt. Nebula softly uttered, "Thanos has done it," as dust began to drift on Titan. One by one, Tony's allies disintegrated into ash before his eyes. First Drax and Mantis, then Star-Lord. Tony could hardly process the horror. Too weak to stand, he turned to see Peter Parker stumble towards him in sheer panic. The young Spider-Man cried out that he didn't feel good, clutching at Tony, terrified. Tony felt a swell of helpless sorrow as he caught Peter in his arms. "Mr. Stark." "I don't want to go," Peter whimpered, tears in his eyes as his body turned to dust. Tony's own eyes went wide with anguish. He wished desperately he could hold on to the kid, protect him as he'd promised, but Peter vanished into nothingness, leaving Tony holding empty air. That moment broke Tony Stark. He knelt in silence, surrounded by drifting ashes that seconds ago were his friends, on the barren soil of Titan under an alien sky. The weight of failure was unlike anything he'd ever felt. Tony Stark, the man who always found a way out, who always had another plan, had lost. For the first time, there was no witty retort, no half-smile of defiance. As Nebula approached and put a consoling hand on his shoulder, Tony stared, a head in shock, tears mixing with the grime and blood on his face. Half of all life in the universe was gone, including many Tony held dear, and he could do nothing to reverse it. Adrift in space after Thanos' victory, Tony and Nebula managed to pilot the damaged Guardian's ship, the Benatar, away from Titan. But with fuel and life support dwindling, Tony recorded a final message for Pepper. In a heartbreaking monologue, speaking into his Iron Man helmet, Tony expressed his love and regret, his voice gentle and resigned. He told Pepper part of the journey is the end, accepting that he might not make it home. Alone in the silent gulf of space, Tony was ready to die, haunted by loss but comforted by the thought of Pepper's face one last time. He drifted into unconsciousness as oxygen ran out. And then a miracle arrived. Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel, found the ship. Having been alerted by the remaining Avengers on Earth, she literally carried the Benatar back to Earth. On Earth, at the Avengers compound, Steve, Natasha, Bruce, and Thor were reeling from the snap's aftermath when Captain Marvel landed with the ship. They rushed out as the emaciated Tony was carried off the ship, barely alive. Steve's face brightened with relief at seeing Tony, but Tony was in a delirious, grief-stricken state. They put Tony on an IV, and he confronted Steve bitterly over their failure to prevent this tragedy, recalling how Steve had promised they'd lose together, but when time came, they were apart. Tony, in pain and half-crazed with trauma, even ripped off his arc reactor and thrust it at Steve, accusing him and Child for being liars. It was a raw, ugly moment. Tony's anguish laid bare as he collapsed, leaving Steve guilt-ridden and silent. Tony was sedated and put to rest. In the following days, while Tony recovered physically, the Avengers executed one last attempt at retribution. They found Thanos, only to discover he had destroyed the Infinity Stones. The fight was over. Thanos had won. This grim finality led Thor to behead Thanos in anger, but it changed nothing. Tony eventually awoke to this new reality. A universe where half of all people were simply gone. His first thought was to ask Steve, Thanos? And upon learning of Thanos' fate, Tony only quietly replied, "I'm glad, but it's not going to change anything, is it?" He knew revenge hadn't brought back those they lost. With no solution in sight, Tony opted out. He retreated with Pepper, choosing to salvage what life he could. Time jump, 5 years later, 2023. Tony had found an unexpected slice of happiness despite the universe's wounds. He and Pepper lived in a secluded lakeside cabin, and in the wake of the snap, they had a child, Morgan Stark, the little girl Tony once dreamt of. Fatherhood changed Tony profoundly. Morgan was a delightful child and Tony adored her. He taught her engineering basics, tiny potato gun experiments, watched Downton Abbey with her on the couch, and tucked her in every night with the words, "I love you tons," only to hear her giggle and respond, "I love you 3,000. That phrase melted Tony's heart. It became their special saying. For the first time, Tony Stark truly let himself enjoy the simple joys: a family meal, washing dishes with Pepper, watching Morgan play with her toys, including a helmet Tony had made for her. The spectre of his failures still loomed in his eyes sometimes. Pictures of Peter Parker and others lost remained in his home as silent reminders. But Tony tried to move on. He had paid a heavy price and finally gained something precious in return: a family and a peaceful life out of the spotlight. That peace was interrupted one day by the arrival of Steve Rogers, Natasha, and Scott Lang, Ant-Man, at Tony's cabin. Scott, who had been trapped in the quantum realm and returned with knowledge of time vortexes, presented a wild theory: using the quantum realm to travel through time and undo Thanos' snap. Tony immediately bristled. The idea of time travel was far-fetched and, more importantly to Tony, dangerous. He feared risking what he had now, Pepper and Morgan, on a slim chance. With a heavy heart, Tony turned them down, urging Steve to stay for lunch, but accepting when Steve respectfully left with a plan to try anyway. Yet Tony couldn't rest. That night, after putting Morgan to bed, Tony's restless mind tugged at the problem. Part out of guilt and part out of sheer intellectual challenge, Tony pulled out old notes and began to tinker with the concept of quantum navigation. In a montage of trial and error, Tony Stark, the greatest engineer on Earth, solved time travel. He found the key to navigating the quantum realm safely via a time-space GPS mock-up. In disbelief, Tony slumped into a chair when his computer simulation succeeded, whispering, "Shit, I figured it out." His mind raced. Now he held the key to possibly saving everyone that had been lost, including Peter Parker. Tony faced a deep, profound choice. Later that night on the couch, he discussed it with Pepper, who sensed his turmoil. Pepper, seeing Tony's internal conflict, asked gently if he could rest, knowing he had the solution, but chose not to act. She knew Tony's heart. He wouldn't be able to live with himself. With her blessing, Tony decided to rejoin the Avengers and attempt the time heist. Arriving at the Avengers compound, Tony made amends with Steve. In a humble gesture, he returned Captain America's shield to Steve, the same shield he once angrily told Steve he didn't deserve. "My father made it for you," Tony said softly, indicating he'd let go of the resentment. Steve accepted it, understanding the significance. The two comrades, finally reconciled, shared a nod. They were on the same side once more. Thus began the Avengers' most audacious mission: travel to different points in time, retrieve all 6 Infinity Stones, and bring them to the present to undo the snap. Tony and the team refined the plan together. He even got a light-hearted moment of closure by meeting a grown Howard the Duck at the planning table, a bizarre cameo that cracked Tony's stress for an instant with a surprised chuckle. Focused, Tony helped design and build quantum suits and GPS devices for each team member. Before departing, Tony had a tender scene with Pepper and Morgan. Kneeling to his daughter, Tony promised her that he would be back. Morgan, too young to grasp the stakes, just asked for a cheeseburger. Tony smiled, noting she took after him. Pepper was supportive, hiding her worry with a brave face. They exchanged a meaningful look, hope and fear intertwined. and Pepper told Tony to do what he must, quietly conveying, "We'll be fine, just bring them back." Tony embraced his wife and child, then turned to the task at hand. The time heist unfolded in multiple eras. Tony and Steve traveled back to New York in 2012 during the Battle of New York, aiming to collect the Space Stone, Tesseract, and Mind Stone. Disguising themselves amid the 2012 Avengers aftermath, they observed hilarious and enlightening moments like Tony rolling his eyes at his younger self's flamboyance, or quipping that Captain America's old uniform did nothing for your ass, prompting Steve's self-conscious glance, and later, acceptance that indeed that is America's ass. They nearly succeeded in stealing the Tesseract using subterfuge, but 2012, Hulk's unexpected appearance accidentally knocked the case out of Tony's hands, right into Loki's reach, allowing Loki to escape with it. Tony and Steve improvised quickly. With the Space Stone lost in 2012, they decided on a daring detour, jump further back to 1970 where Tony knew both the Space Stone and more PIM particles for return trips existed at Camp Lehigh, New Jersey, where Tony's father worked and Steve originally trained in WTT. Arriving in 1970, Tony had an emotionally cathartic encounter. He crossed paths with Howard Stark, who was alive and middle-aged, roughly the same age Tony was now. Using a fake name, Tony engaged Howard in conversation. Howard mentioned his wife's pregnancy, Tony himself about to be born, and Tony, heart swelling with empathy and longing, gave Howard fatherly advice, in essence telling his own father that he would be a good dad and that his future son would understand that. Everything Howard did was for him. Howard, not realizing who he was speaking to, was struck by the kindness and insight of this stranger. In parting, Tony and Howard shook hands. Tony, voice wavering, thanked his father sincerely for all his efforts. It was closure Tony never imagined he'd get. A chance to say goodbye and "I love you" in his own way. Howard left in his car, musing to his butler Jarvis that the man seemed oddly familiar. Tony watched his father depart with tears of solace in his eyes. In that moment, decades of Tony's internal grief and unresolved feelings towards Howard found peace. With the Space Stone secured and emotional wounds mended, Tony and Steve returned to the present, successful. All teams managed to gather the stones, despite sacrifices including Natasha giving her life for the Soul Stone. Back at the compound, Tony built a new Iron Infinity Gauntlet using nanotech to hold the stones. The debate of who should wield it was short. Bruce, the Hulk, insisted on doing it, given he could best survive the gamma radiation. Tony monitored as Hulk put on the gauntlet. The power surge was immense. Hulk screamed but steadied himself and snapped his fingers. Tony's gauntlet channeled the energy brilliantly. Bruce was badly burned but alive, and it worked. Instantly, life across the universe was restored. Clint's phone buzzed with his wife calling, confirming that those who had vanished were back. However, triumph turned to sudden chaos. Thanos, the Thanos from 2014 who discovered the Avengers' plan through the neural link of his daughter Nebula, used PIM particles to transport his warship to the present. In an ambush, Thanos' ship bombarded the Avengers' compound, obliterating it. The building collapsed into ruins, and Tony, along with Steve and Thor, emerged from the rubble to face Thanos among the devastation. This was the Thanos at the height of his power, though lacking the stones in hand. Tony and the others knew this was the final battle. They wordlessly spread out, encircling Thanos on the ashen remains of the compound's front lawn. Thanos, cold and calculating, vowed to destroy Earth to the last atom and remake a grateful universe. Without hesitation, Thor summoned both Mjolnir and Stormbreaker, assuming a warrior's stance. Steve tightened the straps of his broken shield on his arm. Tony's helmet snapped into place. The big three Avengers launched at Thanos with everything they had. Tony fought strategically, using combined tactics honed over the years. He fired high-intensity repulsor blasts while Thor slammed Thanos with lightning and hammer strikes. Steve used every ounce of his combat skill to exploit openings. Still, Thanos was a juggernaut. At one critical juncture, Thanos knocked irons, man aside brutally, taking Tony out of the fight momentarily by smashing him into a pile of stones. Tony's suit sparked and he groaned in pain, struggling to stand again. As he regained his footing, Tony witnessed an awe-inspiring sight. Steve Rogers wielding Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Steve had proven worthy, and with Mjolnir in hand, he brought the thunder down on Thanos, fighting like a super soldier god. Tony, despite the dire situation, couldn't help but smile with pride and surprise at his friend, even managing a quip later. "Didn't know you had it in you, Cap." But even that wasn't enough. Thanos overwhelmed them one by one. He battered Thor, nearly driving Stormbreaker into the Asgardian's chest. Tony saw this and mustered his remaining power to intervene, blasting Thanos and giving Thor a moment to recover. Then Thanos turned his fury on Tony. In a ferocious exchange, Thanos grabbed Tony's nano-arm and ripped chunks off, then slammed him to the ground. Tony's HUD flickered, one eye exposed through a crack in his helmet, blood on his face. Looked up just in time to see Thanos hurl his massive double-edged sword, shattering Captain America's shield and knocking Steve aside like a rag doll. Tony's heart sank as he and Thor both went down again. For a breathless moment, Thanos' entire army, Leviathans, Chitauri, and Black Order, appeared through a portal. It was an overwhelming force. But on the far end of the battlefield, magical portals of orange spark spiraled open. All the heroes Doctor Strange had rallied reappeared. Black Panther and the Wakandan armies, Sam Wilson flying in on falcon wings, Bucky Barnes, Drax, Star-Lord, Spider-Man, alive and eager, and so many others. The Avengers, in full might, were reassembled. Tony's heart leapt at seeing Peter Parker swing in on a web, very much alive and calling out, "Mr. Stark! Mr. Stark!" Tony dashed across the battlefield, meeting Peter mid-run. Without a word, Tony pulled Peter into a tight hug, eyes brimming. "This is nice," Peter quipped, but Tony could only clutch the kid tighter, a tear of profound relief escaping. He had gotten his surrogate son back. "I'm sorry," Peter started, as if apologizing for what happened, but Tony just shook his head and kept holding him. It was one of the purest, most heartfelt moments of Tony's life. Now with allies at their side and hope reignited, Tony got back into the fight. He teamed up with Pepper, Rescue in her blue armor, at one point fighting back-to-back in a beautiful display of mutual support and trust, the pair blasting down Thanos' Leviathans in tandem. Amid the chaos, Tony's focus turned to the one thing that mattered, the nano gauntlet containing the stones which Hulk had used and dropped. A wild game of keep-away ensued. Tony chased after as Clint passed the gauntlet to T'Challa, who was waylaid by Thanos' minions. Then Peter Parker picked it up, initiating a frantic instant kill mode to get through swarming aliens, and nearly made it across the field. Peter finally stumbled and was surrounded by outriders, but Tony saw Carol Danvers slice through Thanos' ship and swoop in. Captain Marvel took the gauntlet from Peter, and with support from the assembled female heroes, she barreled toward the quantum portal van. But Thanos destroyed the van with a last blast of rage. Tony regrouped with
Strange on the sidelines.
Doctor Strange caught Tony's gaze, raising one finger, silently reminding Tony that out of 14 million outcomes, one was the path to victory. Tony's eyes met Strange's and understanding dawned. This was the endgame scenario, and it would require everything from Tony. Sure enough, Thanos managed to wrench the nano gauntlet away from Carol. He placed it on his hand. Tony could see Thanos flexing his fingers, trying to activate the stones. With horror, Tony realized if Thanos snapped again, this time he would wipe out all life and remake the universe. Across the field, Tony locked eyes with Strange, who wordlessly signaled that this was their only chance. Tony's mind raced. Possibilities, suit integrity, the location of each stone on Thanos's gauntlet. Summoning every drop of will and genius, Tony launched himself at Thanos in one last desperate gambit. He grappled with Thanos, trying to snatch the gauntlet, or at least the stones. Thanos head-butted Tony, staggering him. The Titan swatted Tony aside effortlessly and looked down. The nano gauntlet was intact on his hand. Thanos smirked at the struggling Stark and proclaimed, "I am inevitable," snapping his fingers. But nothing happened. The gauntlet's lights had dimmed. The stones were gone. Thanos heard a clinking sound and turned to see Tony on one knee. On Tony's right hand, the 6 infinity stones were flowing and embedding into place on his
own nanotech glove, the metal forming around them. Tony had used the nanite's adaptability to steal the stones in that brief tussle. He looked at Thanos, exhaustion and resolve etched in his face. With a final surge of strength, Tony Stark, the man who always had a backup plan, simply replied, "And I am Iron Man." He snapped his fingers.
A blinding white energy blasted forth. Thanos and his entire army began disintegrating to dust, victim to Tony's snap. But the power coursing through Tony was immense, catastrophic. Normal humans cannot wield infinity stones, even in a suit. Tony was just a man. The nanosuit tried to shield him, but the Stark tech was overwhelmed. The right side of Tony's body charred severely. Nanotech burned away to expose mortal flesh beneath. As the light faded, Tony remained kneeling, arm outstretched, posture eerily still. Thanos, defeated and resigned, collapsed into ash in the distance. The battleground fell quiet except for the crumbling of Thanos' war machines turning to dust. Thor and Steve realized something was very wrong with Tony. They rushed to his side. The Iron Man armor was largely gone, blown off from the chest and right arm. What little remained was blackened and sparking. Tony's face was half covered by a broken helmet, and beneath it his skin was grey, his eyes unfocused. He was alive, but barely. War Machine landed first by Tony. Rhodey removed his helmet, eyes red with tears, and gently touched Tony's shoulder. In that subtle moment, decades of friendship passed between them. No words, just understanding. Rhodey gave Tony a faint nod of love and goodbye. Next came Peter Parker, stumbling over in dread. Mr. Stark, we won, Mr.
"Stark!" Peter cried, collapsing next to Tony and taking his hand. The boy was sobbing, imploring Tony to respond. "We did it, Mr. Stark. You're going to be okay."
Tony, dazed, could only manage the slightest ghost of a smile at Peter, his eyes conveying pride and care one last time. Finally, Pepper gently moved Peter aside. Kneeling in front of Tony, she managed a tearful smile. "Hey," she greeted, softly, voice breaking. Tony's trembling hand reached up slightly as if to say, "It's okay." his eyes locked onto Pepper's, the love of his life. "We're gonna be okay," Pepper assured him with astounding strength. "You can..."
"Rest now." At those words, something eased in Tony's gaze.
He had been fighting all his life, forging, struggling, improvising, and Pepper, with infinite love, gave him permission to let go. Tony Stark's arc reactor flickered, its light fading. Surrounded by his closest friends and his wife's loving face, the last thing he saw, Tony Stark died, having given everything to save everyone. Silence fell over the battlefield except for quiet sobs. The heroes bowed their heads in respect around Tony's lifeless form. Pepper tenderly kissed Tony's cheek and whispered, "We'll be okay." In that sorrowful victory, the world both gained life and lost a great man. Tony Stark's funeral was held at his lake house. It was an intimate yet sprawling gathering of all whose lives he had touched. They floated a tribute on the water, the proof that Tony Stark has a heart, the first arc reactor ringed with flowers. Every Avenger, past and present, stood in somber respect. Pepper and Morgan stood at the front. Morgan clutched Happy's hand, too young to understand fully, only knowing her daddy was gone. Tears shone in many eyes. Steve, Clint, with his resurrected family by his side, Wanda, who understood Tony's sacrifice deeply, Doctor Strange, Captain Marvel, the Guardians, even Nick Fury lurking in the back. They mourned not just Iron Man the hero, but Tony the man, mentor, friend, husband, father. In the days that followed, Pepper found a final message Tony had recorded in case of his death. In a hologram, Tony appeared in their living room, looking at peace. He spoke with a soft smile, addressing Morgan and Pepper. "I love you 3000, he said warmly, towards his little girl, bringing tears to everyone who heard it. "Part of the journey is the end," Tony mused, his recorded self seeming to look right at Pepper. "This is where my story ends. I hope I did enough. If you're seeing this, I hope you know that I couldn't have done any of it without you." The hologram Tony then turned, as if looking out at the world, saying he was hopeful for the future, and telling everyone to take care of each other. "This was always about family," he added softly. With a final wave, the hologram ended, and Tony Stark said goodbye. In the weeks after, the world paid tribute to Iron Man. Murals of Iron Man's face appeared on city walls. The Stark family set up charitable foundations for those displaced by the snap. Peter Parker, back in high school, kept a framed photo of himself with Tony and resolved to honor Tony's legacy by continuing to help others, carrying the lessons Tony taught him. Pepper, though grieving, was strong. She later founded the Rescue Foundation in Tony's memory to provide aid in global crises. And Morgan Stark, that bright little soul, grew up always hearing what a hero her father was, not because he could fly in a suit, but because of the choices he made and the heart he showed. Tony Stark had started as an arrogant futurist, a genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, living for himself. Through cave captivity, heroism, failures and love, he transformed into something far greater, a man who would lay down his life for the universe. In his journey from selfishness to selflessness, he proved Steve Rogers' challenge wrong. In the end, Tony was the guy to lay on the wire, taking the weight of sacrifice so others could live. He had grappled with his own demons, created and defeated them, and in doing so, saved countless lives. From genius playboy to savior of the universe, Tony Stark's life was the ultimate proof that even the most flawed person can grow into a hero. And so as the nights became quiet again and peace spread across the cosmos, Tony Stark could finally rest. His heart, which had beat so passionately and sometimes chaotically, was still. But the legacy of Iron Man lives on. In every arc reactor lighting a home, in every suit of armor inspired by his, in each young mind he influenced, like a boy named Harley who became an engineer, or a daughter named Morgan who would one day understand the magnitude of her father's deeds. Tony's spirit persists. His voice echoes whenever the Avengers unite or when anyone says the words, "I am Iron Man," a statement now synonymous with unwavering determination in the face of impossible odds. The story of Tony Stark is one of redemption, of heart triumphing over ego and of love for friends, for family, for humanity, motivating the greatest act of heroism the universe had ever seen. And although his journey has reached its end, the world he saved will never forget the man in the iron suit who taught them all what true heroism meant. In the quiet afterglow of victory, as children laugh and families reunite, as one era ends
and another begins.